Habakkuk is a unique figure among the prophets of the Old Testament. He is identified as the author of one of the shortest books of the Bible, which bears his name. His story, though brief, reveals a deeply human and intense character, marked by his relentless pursuit of answers in the face of divine silence. Little is known about his personal life. Unlike other prophets, the text does not mention his lineage, hometown, or occupation. What the book does present is the voice of a man with the courage to question God, seeking answers to the profound concerns of his soul. His name, Habakkuk, translated from Hebrew, means embrace, or one who embraces. This meaning is symbolic, reflecting his stance amid uncertainty and pain. A prophet who embraces both doubt and faith, navigating between them with sincerity and perseverance. It is believed that Habakkuk lived in Judah during the final years before the Babylonian exile, a period marked by significant political and spiritual upheaval. However, his message transcends his immediate context, addressing universal questions about suffering and divine justice. Rather than simply proclaiming judgment or blessing, he presents himself as someone who dialogues with God, seeking to understand his purposes. The uniqueness of Habakkuk lies in the way he relates to God. He does not shy away from expressing his concerns, yet he is also willing to listen and accept the answers given to him. This makes Habakkuk a model of sincere and resilient faith, unshaken by the mystery of divine plans. Although brief in length, the book of Habakkuk has left a profound impact on religious tradition, and his words remain a testimony of faith in times of uncertainty. He is remembered as the prophet who, instead of avoiding his doubts, transformed them into a bridge for a deeper relationship with God. Habakkuk lived in a time of decline that seemed to challenge the most basic principles of justice. The kingdom of Judah, once prosperous under the reign of faithful kings like Josiah, was descending into moral and spiritual collapse. This dark period, brought about not only by corrupt leadership but also by a people straying from their covenant with God, was deeply troubling for the prophet. The nation's deteriorating character was evident, and Habakkuk witnessed it firsthand, feeling powerless in the face of growing injustice. Judah's government was one of the main sources of this disorder. After Josiah's death, the throne was occupied by his successors, who proved either unwilling or incapable of maintaining the spiritual and social reforms he had instituted. Jehoiakim, who reigned during part of Habakkuk's life, is described in other biblical accounts as a king who did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. His administration was marked by oppression, exploitation, and abuse of power. The poor, orphans, and widows, who were meant to be protected under the Mosaic law, were neglected and often exploited. In addition to corruption, the religious environment in Judah was also tainted. The temple in Jerusalem, a sacred symbol of God's presence among his people, had become a place of superficial religious practices. Many religious leaders had abandoned their mission to spiritually guide the people, allowing idolatry to infiltrate even the most basic rituals. Habakkuk, deeply knowledgeable about the covenant between God and Israel, must have felt frustrated witnessing the irreverence and disregard for what was considered sacred. While Judah disintegrated internally, the world around it was also a stage for dangerous transformations. Babylon, under the rule of Nebuchadnezzar, was consolidating its power as the greatest military and political force of the time. They had defeated the Assyrians, the former rulers of the region, and were rapidly advancing, spreading fear and destruction wherever they went. Nations that once felt secure now trembled before the Babylonian threat. For Judah, this reality was terrifying. The rise of Babylon, however, was not just a matter of military strength. It represented a crisis of identity for Judah. How could God's chosen people be so vulnerable to a foreign power? This question must have been particularly difficult for Habakkuk. He knew that the Babylonians were cruel, notorious for their brutality toward conquered peoples. The mere fact that they were growing in power seemed to affront the very idea of divine justice. Habakkuk also observed the growing violence within Judah's borders. The concept of shalom, the peace and harmony that should characterize life in covenant with God, had been replaced by oppression and fear. The strong prevailed while the weak were crushed. For a prophet like Habakkuk, who deeply believed in justice and righteousness, this reality was unbearable. He knew that God was just, holy, and powerful, but he could not understand why God allowed such a situation to persist. The circumstances he witnessed seemed utterly at odds with God's nature as the judge and protector of his people. This apparent contradiction was one of the greatest burdens Habakkuk carried in his soul. The Judah of Habakkuk's time was a nation on the brink, both spiritually and politically. This reality sets the stage for the narrative of the book and explains why the prophet was driven to question God so intensely. Habakkuk was not merely a passive observer. He was a man deeply invested in the fate of his people and above all in understanding God's purposes. Habakkuk begins his book with a cry of despair. The first words we encounter are a prayer, but not an ordinary one. They are words laden with anguish, frustration, and a plea for answers. "How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you, violence, but you do not save?" Habakkuk 1:2. The prophet saw a Judah filled with corruption. The powerful oppressed the weak. Violence and injustice had become commonplace, and even the religious leaders who were supposed to guide the people had succumbed to corruption. Instead of defending the vulnerable, they allowed injustice to thrive. This situation created a crisis of faith in Habakkuk, leading him to question God's silence. However, this is not an act of rebellion or disrespect. It reflects his profound trust in God. Habakkuk believed that God was powerful enough to act and just enough to want to intervene. Thus, divine silence in the face of injustice made no sense to him. His question, "How long?" expresses a sense of urgency and the struggle to reconcile the delay with the idea of a God who hears and responds. Habakkuk's cry echoes the laments of many throughout history. The question, "Why does God allow injustice?" is not exclusive to the prophet. It is a universal concern that arises whenever we encounter suffering and evil in the world. This aspect makes the book of Habakkuk incredibly relevant, showing us that even the most faithful can grapple with doubts and difficult questions. Habakkuk not only questions, but also details the injustices he witnesses. He mentions violence, destruction, strife, and the dominance of wrongdoing in Judah. The law, which was meant to be an instrument of justice, had become powerless. He laments that the Torah, God's divine instruction, was being ignored, and that courts, instead of upholding justice, favored the wicked. This reality deepened his unrest. If God's own people were so far from his ways, how could they be a light to the surrounding nations? As a prophet, Habakkuk struggled to understand why God would allow such a situation to persist without taking action to restore order and justice. Reading Habakkuk's words, we see that he does not settle for easy answers. He does not seek comfort in superficial explanations. Instead, he lays his doubts and sorrows before God with honesty. This teaches an important lesson. Questioning, when done with a sincere heart, is a form of faith. Habakkuk does not distance himself from God because of his doubts. Rather, he draws closer. In this sense, Habakkuk is not just a prophet, but also a representative of humanity before God. He voices the questions that many carry in their hearts, but lack the courage to verbalize. He demonstrates that God does not fear our questions, and that a relationship with Him is strong enough to withstand our deepest doubts. At this initial moment, Habakkuk remains engulfed in his anguish. He cries out for justice, but is met with silence. His questioning echoes like a cry into the void, embodying the state of many who find themselves in times of despair. What makes his story so powerful is that even in his pain, he continues to turn to God, demonstrating that faith is not the absence of doubt, but the willingness to bring those doubts before the Creator. Habakkuk is the prophet who teaches us that the path to understanding begins with honesty before God. He reminds us that questioning is part of the process of faith, and that God, in his patience and wisdom, not only accepts our questions but also responds, though his answers may challenge all we expect. When Habakkuk lays his concerns before God, the response he receives is both surprising and unsettling. God declares that he is acting, but in a way Habakkuk could never have imagined. Look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed, for I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. Habakkuk 1 verse 5. God reveals that Babylon, a cruel, violent, and oppressive nation, will be the instrument of judgment against Judah. For Habakkuk, this response is shocking. How could God, who is just and holy, use a nation even more wicked to address the sins of Judah? The description God provides of the Babylonians reinforces this perplexity. He calls them a ruthless and impetuous nation that invades lands and destroys peoples. They are depicted as arrogant, relying solely on their own strength, and as voracious predators, capturing their victims without mercy. God does not downplay Babylon's wickedness. He acknowledges their destructive nature, but asserts that they will serve as instruments of his justice. This declaration reveals a profound and often challenging aspect of God's character: his absolute sovereignty. He is capable of using even the actions of the wicked to fulfill his purposes. However, this sovereignty does not imply that God condones evil. He does not approve of Babylon's behavior, but, in his wisdom, uses their actions to discipline Judah and ultimately bring judgment upon Babylon itself. For Habakkuk, this response creates a new crisis. He had questioned God's silence in the face of injustice in Judah, but now he must grapple with an even more troubling revelation: the idea that evil would be permitted as part of God's plan. This revelation tests his faith on a deeper level, challenging his understanding of justice. The choice of Babylon as a divine instrument raises theological questions that resonate throughout biblical history. God often allowed foreign nations to be used to discipline his people, as seen with Egypt, the Philistines, and the Assyrians. Yet, each of these nations also faced divine judgment for their wickedness. This suggests that the use of such instruments is not an endorsement of their actions, but part of a greater plan, one that transcends immediate human understanding. What makes God's response particularly challenging for Habakkuk is that it does not resolve the problem of injustice. Instead, it shifts it to another level. The prophet must now contend with the idea that God, in his sovereignty, may allow suffering and chaos as a means to achieve his ultimate purposes. This perspective may seem contradictory, but it highlights the infinite scope of God's understanding. What appears to Habakkuk as a concession to evil is, from God's viewpoint, a necessary step toward redemption and the restoration of justice. God's plans, while often incomprehensible to human minds, are always aimed at a greater good that aligns with his perfect character. God's response to Habakkuk also challenges us to reconsider our own understanding of how he operates in the world. We often expect God to intervene directly and immediately to correct evil and restore order. However, Habakkuk's story demonstrates that God's ways are often mysterious and unexpected. The choice of Babylon as his instrument carried a profound message for the people of Judah. It showed that sin has consequences and that God is faithful to his word. Yet it also carried an implicit promise. God's judgment is not the end of the story. Just as he would bring judgment upon Judah, he would also bring restoration, and even the Babylonians would face divine justice in due time. After receiving God's answer that Babylon would serve as the instrument of correction For Judah, Habakkuk confronts a new unease. In his mind, an even greater question arises. How can a holy and just God tolerate the rise of a nation as cruel and arrogant as Babylon? This doubt prompts the prophet to present a new appeal to God, deepening the dialogue that defines the book. Habakkuk begins this second questioning by acknowledging God's character. He declares, "Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die." Habakkuk 1:12. Here the prophet reaffirms his trust in God as the eternal sovereign, but the tension between his faith and the circumstances around him is evident. Despite his belief in divine justice, Habakkuk struggles to comprehend how God, who is pure and holy, could allow a people like the Babylonians to prosper and destroy other nations. Babylon, in its historical context, was feared for its unchecked violence and the merciless way it treated the nations it conquered. They plundered, enslaved, and destroyed without mercy. To Habakkuk, it was inconceivable that God could use such an impious nation to bring judgment. In his prayer, he expresses this conflict. "Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves?" Habakkuk 1:13. Habakkuk's description of the Babylonians is striking. He compares them to fishermen who capture peoples like fish, using nets and hooks to drag their prey. Habakkuk 1:14-15. These images convey the brutality with which Babylon treated its enemies, reducing them to mere trophies of war. Moreover, the Babylonians worshipped their own tools of conquest, glorifying their armies and their strength as if they were divine. Habakkuk is further perplexed because, although Judah was guilty of many sins, the Babylonians seemed far worse. He cannot understand why God allows those who are more wicked than Judah to prevail. This apparent reversal of justice leaves the prophet even more confused, and he asks, will he keep on emptying his net, destroying nations without mercy? Habakkuk 1:17. After expressing his second round of questions, Habakkuk makes an important decision. He declares that he will position himself as a watchman on a guard tower, waiting for God's response. "I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me, and what answer I am to give to this complaint." Habakkuk 2:1. This scene is rich in symbolism. Habakkuk assumes the role of a sentinel, someone who watches from a high vantage point, waiting for signs and movements. He does not give up on seeking answers, but adopts a posture of expectation and patience. God's initial silence does not discourage him. Instead, he resolves to wait until the Creator speaks again. The watchtower, in this context, is not merely a physical location, but also a state of mind, one of spiritual vigilance and trust that God will reveal his plans. Habakkuk knows that God is just and that his response will come at the right time. This waiting is a form of preparation, setting the stage for God to respond with even greater clarity and comprehensiveness, revealing his justice and his plan for dealing with both Judah and the Babylonians. After positioning himself as a watchman and waiting patiently, Habakkuk finally hears God's voice again. God begins his response by instructing Habakkuk to record the vision he is about to receive. "Write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets so that a herald may run with it." Habakkuk 2:2. Writing on tablets was a common practice for recording important messages meant for public proclamation. This command underscores that the revelation was not just for Habakkuk, but for all the people of Judah. The message would serve as a source of hope for those awaiting the fulfillment of divine justice. God then reveals a central truth. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay. Habakkuk 2:3. This establishes the tone of the vision. God assures Habakkuk that his justice will be revealed at the appointed time, although from a human perspective, it might seem as though action is delayed. In God's timing, it will occur exactly as planned. This is a reminder that the divine timeline operates beyond human comprehension. God continues his response with a principle that would become a cornerstone of Jewish and Christian faith. The righteous will live by their faith. Habakkuk 2:4. This simple yet powerful statement highlights the distinction between those who trust in God and those who rely on their own strength. While the arrogant, like the Babylonians, exalt themselves and trust in their conquests, the righteous will find life and security by placing their faith in God's plan. This declaration not only addresses Habakkuk's immediate concerns, but also offers a timeless truth. Faith is the foundation for enduring trials, waiting for justice, and trusting in the ultimate sovereignty of God. God describes in detail the fate reserved for Babylon, one of the most powerful and feared nations of its time. He announces a series of woes, or condemnations, that denounce the specific sins of this nation and proclaim the judgment that will fall upon it. The woes are presented as poetic oracles, each exposing an area where Babylon had transgressed, revealing the nature of its arrogance, violence, and idolatry. Although Babylon was used as an instrument of correction for Judah, God makes it clear that the nation will not escape his just hand. First woe, against greed and theft. The first woe denounces those who amass wealth dishonestly, plundering other nations and oppressing the weak. Woe to him who piles up stolen goods and makes himself wealthy by extortion. How long must this go on? Habakkuk 2:6. God declares that the plundered nations will rise against Babylon, demanding retribution for its actions. What the Babylonians unjustly accumulated will be taken from them, and their violence will rebound upon their own heads. Second woe, against violence and injustice. The second woe condemns Babylon's efforts to secure its power and safety through bloodshed and oppression. Woe to him who builds his house by unjust gain, setting his nest on high to escape the clutches of ruin. Habakkuk 2:9. God proclaims that all of Babylon's attempts to build a secure fortress at the expense of others will be in vain. The very stones of the walls will cry out against them, and the structure of their nation will crumble, exposing the futility of relying on their own strength. Third woe, against exploitation and corruption. Here, God rebukes Babylon for its attempts to humiliate and corrupt other nations, exposing them to sin and shame. Woe to him who gives drink to his neighbors, pouring it from the wineskin till they are drunk, so that he can gaze on their naked bodies. Habakkuk 2:15. The prophet uses a metaphor to describe how Babylon manipulated nations, using its power to subjugate and humiliate conquered peoples. God promises that Babylon too will drink the cup of his wrath and face the shame it inflicted on others. Fourth woe, against idolatry. The fourth woe is a direct denunciation of idolatry, which characterized Babylon and many other nations of the time. Woe to him who says to wood, "Come to life," or to lifeless stone, "Wake up." Can it give guidance? It is covered with gold and silver. There is no breath in it. Habakkuk 2:19. This oracle highlights the futility of trusting in idols, lifeless objects adorned with gold and silver, but incapable of offering true guidance or help. God highlights the futility of trusting in idols, emphasizing that they are the work of human hands, incapable of speaking or acting. He contrasts this impotence with his own majesty, declaring that he is in his holy temple and that the whole earth should be silent before him. Habakkuk 2:20. The woes pronounced against Babylon serve not only as a declaration of judgment, but also as a reminder to Habakkuk and the people that, Although the Babylonians seemed invincible at the time, their power was temporary, and their actions would not go unpunished. These announcements of judgment confirm that God sees and responds to all forms of evil, reaffirming that He does not overlook the suffering caused by the arrogance and cruelty of the wicked. Babylon, though used to discipline Judah, was not above divine judgment. God contrasts two types of people, the arrogant and the righteous. The arrogant, primarily represented by the Babylonians, rely on their own strength and exalt their position. They are filled with pride and build their empires through violence, exploitation, and idolatry. In contrast, the righteous are described as those who, regardless of circumstances, remain steadfast in their faith in God. The importance of faith in the book of Habakkuk is closely tied to waiting. God had promised that the vision would be fulfilled at the appointed time, even if it seemed delayed. Habakkuk and the people of Judah would need to trust that God was at work, even if His plans were not immediately visible. This trust was essential to endure the trials to come, both from the judgment upon Judah and the oppression of the Babylonians. The final chapter of the book of Habakkuk is marked by a significant shift in the prophet's tone. After presenting his questions and hearing God's answers, Habakkuk now expresses a prayer that becomes a song of praise. This final moment reflects his response to the revelations he received, demonstrating how he processes and accepts God's plan. The prayer begins with a reverent acknowledgement of God's power. Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds. Repeat them in our day, in our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. Habakkuk 3:2. Habakkuk recalls God's great deeds in the past, acknowledging His authority over history and His power to intervene on behalf of His people. He asks God to act once more, demonstrating His justice and mercy, even amid the wrath that brings judgment. In the following verses, the prophet describes a vision of God coming in glory. The language is filled with grand imagery, evoking the Exodus, when God delivered Israel from Egypt, and other historical events where His hand was evident. He speaks of God coming from Teman and Mount Paran, regions associated with the desert journey. Habakkuk depicts rays of light emanating from His hands, showcasing His power. His splendor was like the sunrise. Rays flashed from His hand, where His power was hidden. Habakkuk 3:4. Habakkuk portrays God as the Lord of creation, causing the earth to tremble and the mountains to crumble before His presence. He mentions the dread of the nations and the power of natural forces under God's command, illustrating that nothing can withstand Him. This description reaffirms God's absolute dominion over all creation and human history. The prophet continues to recall God's mighty works, such as the power He displayed when parting the sea and defeating powerful enemies for His people. He describes scenes of divine victory, like when God used nature to protect Israel or judged nations that opposed His purposes. In wrath you strode through the earth, and in anger you threshed the nations. You came out to deliver your people, to save your anointed one. Habakkuk 3:12-13. These memories are not just a celebration of the past, but an expression of trust in what God will do in the future. Habakkuk understands that just as God acted before, He will act again, even if justice seems delayed in the present. At the climax of his prayer, Habakkuk reveals an inner transformation. While he acknowledges the suffering and hardships to come, he declares his absolute trust in God. He accepts that Babylon's destruction will be preceded by times of great tribulation, but chooses to trust in the Lord as his source of strength and salvation. Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior. Habakkuk 3:17-18. These words reflect a faith that transcends circumstances. Habakkuk prepares to face scarcity, loss, and hardship with joy in God. He does not rely on material goods or favorable conditions, but on the Lord's faithfulness. The song concludes with a declaration of strength. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to tread on the heights. Habakkuk 3:19. Habakkuk's prayer and song serve as a poetic and theological conclusion to his journey. From initial questioning to renewed trust, the prophet offers a response filled with reverence and acceptance of God's plan. The relevance of Habakkuk lies in his ability to address fundamental human questions: suffering, divine silence, the wait for justice, and the need for faith. His story remains a reminder that God is present even when his actions are not immediately visible, and that trust in him is the foundation for facing any crisis. Thank you.